Thank you, Giles. Well, with us now is the new Chief Secretary to the Treasury, the Liberal Democrat MP, David Laws. David Laws, picking up on one of the points there from Robert Choate, what does make you believe that the unelected officials for the Office for Budget Responsibility will be any better at these forecasts than government?
Well, I think that if we look at the present situation, where the most important forecasts in the budget, the growth forecasts, can actually be fixed by a politician, by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, or even in some circumstances the Prime Minister overturning the Chancellor's forecast, most people would just say, that is nuts. You know, there are huge incentives.
But what makes you think that they'll be right with their forecasts?
Because I think that they have less of an incentive than politicians do to fix the forecast to suit the political circumstances. We all know that governments coming up to elections like to be able to say that the public finances are in a good state so that they can have a tax giveaway or avoid putting up taxes in difficult circumstances. It's not right, it cannot be right that politicians fix those forecasts, and I don't believe that any politician will go back on what we've announced today in the future years.
You could say it suits you and the Conservatives in coalition to do this because you can blame all the forecasts that you believe are wrong and have been too optimistic on the previous government. But what happens in 6 months, in a year's time, when Sir Alan Budd comes forward and says, actually, those growth forecasts were way too optimistic, the deficit is much, much bigger? Will you opt for tax rises or more spending cuts?
What we're going to have to do in the budget statement in June, and George Osborne announced the date of that today, is look at the scale of the budget hole that we've got, and that will be informed by Alan Budd.
Yes, I understand that, but what happens in 6 months to a year's time? We know about the emergency budget, we know the announcements that you're going to make, some of them, in terms of reducing the budget deficit. But what happens in 6 months or a year's time? What will you personally, as a Liberal Democrat, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, say if those forecasts were even worse or way out than you originally thought and the Office for Budget Responsibility thought? Will you opt for spending cuts or tax rises?
We've made very clear in our manifesto and in the coalition agreement that our preference is that spending should bear the burden of bringing down the deficit, and that is very clearly our position. But clearly what we're going to be doing between now and the budget statement and in the spending review is seeing precisely how much progress we can make in bringing down spending without affecting the key priority areas for the public. And it's that judgment that will determine how much we need to do, if anything, on taxation.
So what changed your mind in terms of when to start cutting? You now agree with your Conservative colleagues that it would be disastrous to delay cuts to public spending. What changed your mind?
I think two things are really important. I mean, the first is that there has been these huge uncertainties and market speculation over the last few months which have damaged countries like Greece, which have threatened to extend to other countries in the European Union. And I think it's incredibly important that a new coalition government sends out this signal of determination to reduce the deficit. And the second thing is that we have received advice, both from the Bank of England and the Treasury, that this scale of reduction of budgets for this year, because the £6 billion will be imposed in this particular year, can be imposed without damaging growth, and that's incredibly important to us.
But if you're so concerned about reducing the deficit now, I mean, are you going to use all of the £6 billion from cuts? Are you going to use all of that to bring down the deficit?
We've said that the great majority of it will be used to bring down the deficit.
If it's such a big problem, why aren't you using every single penny to bring down the deficit?
Because we agreed in the coalition agreement that there may be some things that we can do,
for example,
which will help to sustain the recovery. And we cited a number of things in the coalition agreement about green projects, about training, about investment in infrastructure. And we want to look over the next week, before the announcement that I make next Monday, on whether some proportion of these savings should go into those areas to help the parts of the economy that have been particularly damaged by this recession.
Do you find that a convincing argument to start cutting now, otherwise it will be disastrous, Brendan Barber?
No, we've supported the argument that the priority now really ought to be getting out of recession, building a sustainable recovery, and we're not at that position yet, and so we don't think the time is right to start cutting now. But I'm particularly worried that the scale of cuts we might be facing, not just immediately, but a little bit down the road, could drive us back into recession.
Now, what do you say then? Particularly, you talk about protecting these frontline services. Do you agree with this view that the Liberal Democrats are there, and you, and particularly in the Treasury, there to soften any of the more draconian cutting proposals put forward by the Conservatives?
I want to be in the Treasury for two reasons. Firstly, I don't think this coalition can last unless we accept joint responsibility for these difficult decisions. Otherwise, it would simply be Lib Dems throwing stones outside the Treasury building. But the second thing is, we have a coalition agreement which embeds a lot of the things that are really important to the Lib Dems. More money to fund deprived youngsters in our schools to improve their education. The tax reforms designed to help people on low and middle incomes. And I think it's essential to have a Liberal Democrat voice in the Treasury to make sure those things are implemented.
Have you
to make
used your
sure
influence
the coalition...
yet? Can you give us an example of where you've managed to exercise that influence?
Well, I indicated this morning at the press conference with George that we've already both received representations from departments, from civil servants in departments, about the type of things that should be cut over the year ahead. And we have jointly said no to some of those representations.
And which programmes are those?
Well, I won't go into the ones because those are obviously private, but there are some areas that would have damaged public services that we have said no to.
So David Laws has said, Brendan Barber, that he has worked, he claims, to protect certain services. Are you reassured by that?
Well, I think all the politicians have been guilty of trying to make this distinction between what they call frontline services and these painless cuts that can be made to people and parts of the organisation that are somewhere in the shadows in the background.
But Brendan,
I just don't think that's a realistic distinction.
You accept that it's sensible. All organisations, particularly when they've had very big increases in the budgets, as we have had in public spending over the last 10 years, all of us end up with some things in our budget which are lower priority, which occasionally need to be reviewed to protect the things that you and your members care about, and many of the public as well.
Well, of course, there always have to be choices made, absolutely, about priorities. And what I think is going to be critical over this next period, I think you and colleagues in the Liberal Democrats have been at pains to say you want to see fairness govern these decisions. Well, that's going to be the acid test, I think, that everybody will be applying.
Right. We're happy to be judged by that test.
What are going to be the consequences? Who's going to be impacted on by the decisions that are made?
I'm happy to be judged by that test. I accept it's going to be extremely difficult, but that will be at the centre of our decision-making.
Just briefly before we end here, what was your reaction to the note that was left to you, David Laws, that lovely welcoming note from your predecessor, Labour's Liam Byrne, saying we've run out of cash?
Yeah, well, I had to chuckle when I received it. I thought when I got this note and the civil servant said, you know, your predecessor has left you some advice, I thought, how kind of him. This must be about how to deal with other ministers, about the complex way of making decisions in the Treasury. And it was just this very short note which said, "Dear Chief Secretary, I'm sorry to have to tell you the money's run out." And it was honest. I mean, I think most of us knew that from the...
Is that true, then? Are you saying the money has completely run out?
Well, we clearly have a massive deficit, so it's more than run out.
What would you write back to him?
Well, I would thank him for that very honest... I would thank him for that very honest advice, which I'll be reminding Labour frontbenchers of over the months ahead. You can be sure of that.
Yeah, thank you very much, David Laws.